Hey everybody, take it easy, Jono here from Elder Trolls Gaming, and this video is going to be about home theater surround for gaming and what you need to know. What things might you need, and in the end, is it worth it? I'll try to give a rundown on how this all works, and this will all be according to my experience playing around and tweaking and upgrading mine over the past 15 years. So if you're tired of gaming with a headset, or your TV speakers just aren't clear enough and you're having trouble hearing dialogue in your games or your movies, or if you have been wanting to get into surround and home theater for gaming, but you just don't know where to start, this video is for you. Whether you're on Xbox or PS5, or even have a PC connected to your TV, these things should all apply, as the surround components are external to those specific platforms or devices you're using, other than the configuration and setting up the surround on each of those devices, but I'm not going to get into that here, because let's not put the cart before the horse. Am I right? Provided you want to do any of this, you'll have to look into tuning and EQing your setup, which you can typically do with the automatic system that comes with your receiver, or there are lots of resources online to help you with that. First off, right off the rip, I want to address everyone who's going to comment and say, oh, I have a sound bar. What about sound bars? I've been looking into those. Sound bars are fine, and there are very good ones, but they do not give you surround sound unless they actually come with their own satellite speakers, or you can purchase separate satellite speakers for that model. There are many that come with virtual surround or Dolby Atmos support, where they try and bounce the sound off of your ceiling and off of your walls and all of this to create a virtual surround sound. And regardless of the sound quality that they offer, which can be good, that's just fake surround. It's plain and simple. And its effectiveness will entirely depend on your room. It will in no way be as effective as a discrete system in terms of directionality and immersion. For some of those Atmos soundbars, you're still spending many hundreds of dollars as well. So let's go through some of the things that you will need for your surround sound. Obviously, you'll need some speakers, but how many? But what configuration? There are a few different configurations you may want to look at depending on how much space you have or your budget, and of course, how many speakers your amp or receiver is able to support. More on that later. So you could have a 4.0, 4.1, 5.0, 5.1, 7.0, 7.1. What does this mean? Well, the first number is how many speaker channels, and the number after the point is how many subwoofers. Real simple. 5.1 means 5 speakers, 1 subwoofer. A 5.1 setup will have your left, center, right, 2 surrounds, and a subwoofer. 7.1 has the same as 5.1, but it has 2 extra surrounds. If you're looking into Dolby Atmos, that adds height speakers in your ceiling or up top, depending on where you want to mount them. For that, you add another point, like 5.1.2, which would mean 5 speakers, 1 subwoofer, and 2 height speakers. Some setups can have more than 1 subwoofer and would be noted as 5.2.2 or 7.2.2 or 7.2.4, etc. Of course, you do have the option of going with a 2.1 or 3.1, which is not surround sound, but it is possible for you to start with a 2 or 3 channel setup and add surround sound speakers later. And typically it's not really as important for your surrounds to match your front speakers. So then let's talk about the front speakers, your main speakers, your LCR, your left, center, right. Typically you want these to be the same brand or from the same series or model, just so they kind of match each other in sound and tonality. But that's not a hard requirement. If you find a good deal on a pair for your left and right separately from something you find for your center, it's not the end of the world. But these are your main speakers and your most important speakers, with an emphasis on the center channel. That is where the dialogue comes from. It's what you'll most hear out of all 3 of those speakers. So typically you spend a little more on the center channel and it goes a long way, but that's up to you. I'm just here to let you know. Your surround speakers can typically be smaller bookshelf speakers. But for your front speakers, let's talk about that. Should you use towers? Should you use bookshelf speakers? Now, obviously, if you're limited for space, bookshelves are a better option. I personally use bookshelf speakers as my front, left, and right because I have a small room, and I had a set of tower speakers that I had for years. But when I moved into my current house, in my TV room now, the way I had to place them, one was kind of hiding behind the end of my couch, and the speakers were kind of firing into the couch. So it wasn't ideal. I sold them and I moved to bookshelves on stands. Now the speaker is above the end of my couch. It's not obstructed by anything. and I'm getting direct sound. So that's one example of why you may want one over the other. One reason you may want to use towers over bookshelves is that towers will give you typically better bass response, and because they're bigger, they can be better for a bigger room where you just need a little bit more. You could also get a set of towers if you want to hold off on getting a subwoofer. Towers will fill your bass out a little bit more than a pair of bookshelves would. So speaking of which, subwoofer. Do you need one? No, you don't absolutely need a subwoofer. They can be quite expensive, so it's something you can leave for later if you want to save some cash up front. In my experience with my cheap low-powered subwoofers that I've had, I feel they kind of just made loud, boomy noise and didn't really have good, impactful bass. So I'd say if you're not going to get something that has a bit higher output that you'll actually be able to feel, then you can probably just skip it for now and maybe get a set of towers at first. As an example, I had a cheap $100 subwoofer that I think was rated at like 45 watts or something like that, which isn't much. I mean, it was loud, it made lots of noise, but I couldn't really feel the bass. It was more just like fatiguing my ears, which is what I realized after upgrading years later to a bigger one that was rated at 325 watts, and it was just a night and day difference. When the bass hits now, I feel the air move. You feel it in your bones. Now, let's talk about height speakers. Do you need them? No, you don't need them. They are nice to have. If you want the full experience and immersion, they add more to the cost and quite a bit of a headache in mounting and running wires though. So be warned and consider that. If you have a PS5 or Xbox Series X, both are UHD 4K Blu-ray players, so you can get the best possible sound from your movies on those. If you are interested in that and getting into that, I would say that yes, maybe spring for the height speakers. Even without height channels, the sound difference on a Blu-ray is head and shoulders above any streaming service. It is a noticeable difference. It is crisper, louder, fuller, better. If you only stream your movies, I'd say maybe skip the height speakers. The thing you have to realize is that the height channel effectiveness is entirely based on how the production studio masters the final audio track in a given game or movie. If they didn't spend the time to use those channels properly, which I have to admit is more often than not, then you won't get much out of them. So it can be a hit or miss, but when it hits, it's so cool and it's fully immersive. But I do have to say, they'll be the least used speakers out of your whole setup. So let's talk about the heart of your setup, your home theater receiver. This will be the amplifier your speakers use. It will be processing your surround coming from your game console. Provided it supports it, it can also act as an HDMI switch for all of your devices so that you don't have to plug everything into your TV. You plug everything into your receiver. Then there's one single output going from your receiver to your TV, and you just use the remote to switch between the devices. This can be a bit complicated. I'll try not to get too into the weeds here, but what features should you look for in a receiver? First of all, you probably want Dolby Digital. Now, Dolby Digital is the original 5.1 surround sound format, and that'll give you what you want for a basic 5.1 setup. Most, if not all receivers with Dolby Digital will also have the DTS counterpart, which is just a different codec used by some movies for surround. Some movies have both. I'll mostly just be talking about Dolby Digital because that's kind of the standard format everything seems to use now. Other versions of Dolby to look for would be Dolby True HD, which is a high quality lossless audio stream. There's also Dolby Digital Plus, which is a more compressed codec that's used a lot in streaming services now. There are differences in them, but for the most part, these will both give you up to 7.1, with True HD being a higher quality. Dolby Atmos. Now, Dolby Atmos is an object-oriented surround metadata, let's call it, that can be delivered over True HD or Dolby Digital Plus. If you want to get a set of height speakers, you're going to want to make sure your receiver supports Dolby Atmos. Your receiver uses Atmos to virtualize surround through any number of speaker channels that your receiver supports, and your receiver will just kind of make it happen and put the sound to those speakers. One thing you have to keep in mind is that if you want to add height speakers, you need extra channels on your receiver to accommodate that. So if you want a 5.1.2 speaker configuration, you need a 7.1 receiver, or 8 channels, counting for the 7 speakers and a subwoofer. Now, HDMI with ARC, or eARC, or 4K, or 4K pass-through, 8K pass-through. Do you need these? Although these aren't entirely necessary for a very basic 5.1 surround setup, it is nice to have if you have multiple consoles or devices that use HDMI purely because of the HDMI switching. So you don't have so many wires going up to the back of the TV and they all kind of stay down below in the weeds behind your TV unit. If you stream from apps on a smart TV, that's when you'll likely want ARC or eARC, which sends the sound out from the TV to the receiver over the HDMI input. In my opinion, you don't really need to use smart TV apps. In my experience, the TV operating systems are kind of slow and don't work that well. And if you're gaming on a console like a PS5 or Xbox Series X, you can just use the streaming apps on the console. Boom. No need for ARC or HDMI. You can still use optical, which I'll talk about in a bit. Here's the problem with receivers, and the reason most people upgrade their receivers, the reason why I upgraded my receiver. Originally, HDMI receivers only supported 1080p video. So once these consoles came out, like the PS4 Pro, the Xbox One S, the One X, the PS5, the Series X, all of these consoles that could now output 4K and game in 4K and had 4K Blu-ray players in them, they basically made these 1080p HDMI receivers obsolete. And then it happened again. The 4K HDMI receivers became obsolete when HDMI 2.1 came out for the 4K 120 FPS and VRR. So you had to upgrade to an 8K 4K 120 HDMI 2.1 receiver, and these things can get expensive. That being said, you can still use an old receiver with Dolby Digital or Dolby True HD that doesn't have up-to-date HDMI ports. You just have to use the optical output on your console to send the audio signal to the receiver. However, even new receivers won't have more than one or maybe two optical inputs. And keep in mind, HDMI transfers video and audio. So that's why you kind of want HDMI. So if you have any more than one or two devices, you will likely have to spring for an HDMI receiver that supports the resolution you need. It will likely have 4 or 5 or more HDMI inputs. Now, let's talk about the cost. Let's talk turkey. When you're dealing with audio equipment, you may know it can be extremely expensive. You could buy a pair of speakers for $100, or you could buy a pair of speakers that cost $10,000. I'm not going to be making specific recommendations on speakers or receivers, but rather what kind of things you can look for to piece together your setup. First thing I'll say is check the used market. Speakers, I consider an investment, and they last a long time if you take care of them. So typically, you can find very good deals on the used market for quality speakers. Check out Facebook Marketplace or other classified sites. You can find speakers that are up to even 25 years old that would be perfectly good for a modest setup. Look up the model, check for old reviews online. You might be able to find something to see kind of what you're getting into. And you can certainly pick up a used receiver for pretty cheap too. Especially if you don't need HDMI and are only looking for a basic 5.1 setup. You can likely find something for quite cheap. I recently found an older receiver for my friend for a simple setup, and it only cost him like $80 Canadian for a nice Pioneer receiver. But if you're looking for a full-featured 4K 120 pass-through, VRR, Dolby Atmos, and all the new features, you're gonna have to get something relatively new, and it will likely cost a few $100s just for an entry-level model such as the Denon S760. Now, after all that, now that you know what it takes, do you have what it takes? You ask, is it worth it? What will this bring to your gaming experience? Well, of course, the answer is it depends. It depends. If you spend a lot of time gaming on the TV, on your console, if you play primarily 3D single-player adventure and action games that are very cinematic, like Sony's first-party titles, God of War, Spider-Man, like Last of Us, or games like The Witcher 3, Cyberpunk, Final Fantasy VII Rebirth had a really good surround track. If you play a lot of those types of games and want to be more immersed in the story, in the world, and you don't want to always game with a headset on, then yes, I would say you are someone who would get a lot out of a surround sound setup. You'll hear things around you as they happen. If there are explosions and if there's action happening all around you, you're going to hear those things with directionality in your surround speakers. You'll hear the rain or the wind or environmental sounds that will just make it more realistic and immersive. Your dialogue will be more clear and pronounced with a good center channel. On your receiver, you can adjust your levels to whatever you want for your different speakers. It will give you more customizability. If you feel the dialogue is a bit low, you can turn up your center channel speaker. You can turn up your surrounds if you want more out of the surrounds. You can turn down the bass. You can turn up the bass. It just gives you more control than a simple volume up and down slider that you would have on your TV. Another thing is if you are a big movie watcher, obviously surround sound will make movies better. I prefer watching movies at home now, mostly because I don't trust a crowd full of people to shut the hell up when I'm watching a movie, but you get that theater experience in your movies at home. Now, if you mostly play Nintendo Switch or retro 2D games, then no, why would you need a home theater? Why would you need surround sound for that? That's not the type of thing that this is for. Another thing is, I would say, if you play a lot of competitive FPS games, even though object-oriented surround sound does sound like an advantage for multiplayer FPS games, you would have to turn it up so loud to hear those small details that it likely would be distracting. And anyone living with you or next to you, if you share a wall or something like that, they would hate you. I would say stick to the headset for those. That's what I do. But if you spend a lot of time watching movies, and like I said, playing single player, cinematic, adventure story titles on your couch, spend your money where you spend your time. That's what I always say. So that's pretty much it. Hopefully, if this is something you were curious about, you now have a better idea of what you might look for. Let me know if this helped you figure some things out and whether or not you're going to take the plunge into the world of home theater for gaming.